Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something ancient, tender, and just a little strange. You find yourself wandering through a half-lit courtyard, stone cool beneath your feet. The air smells of dust and myrrh. Moonlight spills in through high sandstone columns, and all around you, statues, dozens of them. Tall ones, short ones, some missing noses. They're watching, or maybe listening. Because tonight, you'll learn why people used to whisper to stone. You walk slowly past a statue of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, and catch yourself glancing at his carved beak. Is he judging you? Maybe. But also, maybe not. Because to the ancient Egyptians, these weren't just sculptures. They were living, present, alert. Gods didn't really do off hours. And here's your little reality check. If you lived in Thebes 3,000 years ago and had an existential crisis, a petty feud with your cousin, or just a mild case of romantic humiliation, chances are you whispered it to a statue, out loud, with total sincerity, in a very public place. You probably wouldn't survive this socially today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle down beneath a carved pillar as twilight deepens. The sandstone holds the day's heat, warming your back. Before you, one of the statues looms, its face serene, lips parted just enough to seem mid-thought. This one's old. Like dynasty you lost, count old. And someone, long ago, stood exactly where you are and whispered something soft to it. Not a prayer, not quite. Just something private. Something human. Egyptian temples weren't merely places of worship. They were divine residences. Think of them as cosmic Airbnbs where gods briefly stayed on Earth, with statues acting as their physical bodies. And while the statues might have been carved from limestone, wood, or copper, the belief was clear once ritually activated. They could hear you. Imagine that. Walking into a room knowing the furniture is spiritually conscious. The statue's ears, often sculpted slightly too large, weren't a coincidence. In fact, some gods had ears the size of soup plates, and some temples even displayed giant, free-standing ears. Not to see better, just to hear better. It was like ancient surround sound, only divine. Now, this wasn't a scream, your wishes situation. No, you whispered, quietly, respectfully, as if confiding in a friend who never interrupted. The Egyptians believed that sound had sacred power, and a whisper could carry weight far beyond its volume. Especially if you leaned in, close enough to fog the stone with your breath. And you would do this not in moments of glory, but in the little collapses of daily life. Your sheep wandered off again. Your child won't stop coughing. You're convinced your neighbor is cursing your bread. All whisper, worthy. All statue, appropriate. Now picture it, a teenage boy in sandals, shoulders slumped, whispering awkwardly to the god Ptah. So, I kind of told her I had a chariot. I don't have a chariot. Is the statue amused? Maybe. Are we? A little. But the practice wasn't just quaint. It was deeply emotional. When people felt overlooked by society, they didn't necessarily turn to each other. They turned to something older, something heavier, something that wouldn't speak back but might understand. There's even graffiti in Luxor, where someone carved a message next to a statue, begging the god for justice after being cheated in a trade. He wronged me. You saw it. It reads more like a Yelp review for cosmic accountability. And then there's the question nobody really agrees on. Did people genuinely think the statue heard them? Or did they know it was symbolic, but comforting? Scholars still argue whether the belief was literal or a kind of psychological ritual, a way of processing your feelings by voicing them into a silent, listening presence. But maybe it doesn't matter, because to the person whispering, the relief was real. The temples would grow quiet at night, the official ceremonies finished, incense thinned in the air, but people would still come, sometimes alone, sometimes just passing through. One more whisper, one more chance to be heard by someone, or something that didn't judge. You lean in closer now. The statue's stone surface is pitted, worn by sand and centuries. You feel a strange urge to say something, maybe not even important, just something that needs to leave your chest and drift upward into the dusk. Because in this place, your whisper feels like it matters. You stay quiet for a while, sitting cross-legged in the shadow of the statue. Its expression hasn't changed. Of course it hasn't, but you swear it feels like it's listening. Not judging. Just there, anchored in stone and silence. The Egyptians built a world where gods never fully departed. Unlike some later faiths where the divine lived far away, Egypt's gods were emphatically present. Clothes and statues weren't metaphors. They were containers, homes, occasionally even coworkers in a strange way. You glance around the temple. The pillars loom like tree trunks, painted once, though the colors have long since faded into sun-washed hues. The gods here were expected to live inside these forms. They were invited, invoked, and ritually fed every day. A statue didn't just represent the god, it became the god, after an elaborate opening ceremony called the opening of the mouth. Yes, really. You picture the scene: priests in animal skin sashes waving incense, tapping the statue's lips with special tools, muttering incantations to wake it up. Like shouting, "Rise and shine," to an immortal being carved from sycamore wood. That's how seriously this was taken. Once awakened, the statue was treated like a VIP guest. But here's the part modern minds sometimes trip over. Even though the gods lived in these statues, they didn't sleep. Not really. Not ever. There was no divine snooze button, which meant the gods were always watching, always listening. No pressure, right? So, when you whispered to them, you weren't hoping they'd notice. You knew they were already aware. You were just acknowledging it, like nodding to a neighbor who's already looking straight at you through the blinds. In some ways, this ever-present awareness was comforting. You were never alone, but in other moments, honestly, probably exhausting. Imagine being a baker in 1400 BCE and knowing that even while you burnt the bread, the statue of Khnum, god of creation, was quietly judging your yeast ratios. And yet, people found peace in this relationship. These weren't punishing gods. They were deeply woven into daily life, flaws and all. Bastet was protective but moody. Thoth was wise but cryptic. Set was chaotic but occasionally helpful if you had the right amulet and a good excuse. The idea that gods could listen gave people a sense of control, a private audience with divine power, no appointment necessary. All you needed was sincerity, a good story, and maybe a bit of honey cake left at the base, and people believed they were heard. Not in a fireworks and thunder kind of way, but in quiet gestures. A dream that made sense of a hard week, a coincidence too perfect to ignore. Or just the slow, strange calm that settled in your chest after whispering your shame to a deity with a falcon's head. You brush your fingers lightly along the edge of a nearby offering table. There are still shallow grooves worn into the stone. Places where food was once placed, prayers once mumbled. Offerings weren't grand affairs for most people. A date, a smear of beer, soaked bread, a half-broken ceramic bowl of water. The gods weren't picky. It was the effort, not the packaging. And always, those offerings came with words. Quiet ones, often strange ones. There are records, scratched on papyrus and temple walls, of people whispering for help with things like lost donkeys, confusing dreams, unfaithful spouses, and the always popular, "Please smite my enemy, but gently." One man wrote to the goddess Hathor, "Make her love me, or at least not hate my feet." Relatable. Timeless. Tragic. It wasn't just religious. It was emotional hygiene, like venting to a friend who never interrupts, never leaves, and never accidentally forwards your secret to the village group chat. And statues didn't discriminate. They listened to the priests, sure, but also the market ladies with sore feet, the fishermen with cracked hands, and the children who whispered secrets just because it was fun to think a rock could care. Even pharaohs whispered. There's an inscription from Ramesses II, written not as a command but a plea. If I have done wrong, see it and forgive. For a man who thought of himself as a living god, that's a surprisingly humble request. And he said it to a statue, one of his own, in fact. So, what does that tell you? That, even the most powerful people in the ancient world sometimes needed to say things to someone who wouldn't say anything back. It's a small ritual, whispering to a statue, but it carries something big, bigger than the temple, even. It carries the idea that your voice matters, not because it's loud, but because it's yours. And sometimes, in the presence of stone ears, that's enough. You close your eyes for a second. The air feels thicker now. The statue's silhouette barely glows in the moonlight. You imagine all the voices it's heard. Hundreds, thousands, some joyful, some frantic, some tearful. All of them tucked somewhere inside that ancient gaze. And now, maybe yours is one of them. You wake from a momentary drift. Not quite sleep, not quite thought. Just in time to notice something odd about the statue's head. Not the usual cobra crown or solar disk. No, it's the ears. They're big. Too big to be anatomically accurate. Even by stylized ancient standards, this guy's rocking some serious stone listening gear. You tilt your head and squint. And then you remember that's not a mistake. It's entirely on purpose. Ancient Egyptian artisans weren't just trying to create likenesses. They were designing functionally spiritual hardware. These statues weren't there to look divine. They were built to perform divinity. And if you wanted a god to hear your very quiet, very personal whisper about your very specific domestic drama, well, they'd better have the equipment for it. So yes, oversized ears, sometimes human-shaped, sometimes animal-like, sometimes so exaggerated they looked like carved satellite dishes. In fact, in some temples, standalone ear statues were installed. Giant ears with no faces. You'd kneel before a giant sandstone lobe and whisper into it. It's a little funny, but also kind of beautiful. Because what's more reassuring than the idea that the gods are really, truly listening? You run your hand gently over the coarse surface of one of these stone ears, and for a moment, you can almost hear the echoes. Not of your voice, but of every voice that's ever passed through here. Mothers worrying about sick babies, lovers asking for courage, farmers pleading for rain. This wasn't just spiritual, it was emotional architecture, a place where human vulnerability had shape and ritual and respect. And, weirdly, acoustics. One particular god, Ptah, was often shown with especially prominent ears. He was the creator, the craftsman, the silent type, and also the best listener in the pantheon. People would whisper to his statue like he was the one guy in town who'd never roll his eyes. In some temples, the ears were inset with copper, or polished to a near mirror like sheen, so even if the god wasn't technically responding, you could see yourself reflected in his listening. A gentle cosmic nudge. You're here? I see you. Keep talking. It's easy to laugh now. We live in a world of noise, canceling headphones and infinite digital scroll. But imagine being in a time where the only place you could safely express your doubt, your rage, or your weird dreams about hippos made of fire was a carved hunk of limestone with good ears. And these weren't just adult concerns. Children whispered, too. Some clay ear amulets have been found in old tomes, tiny offerings shaped like ears, inscribed with little names and messages. One had a boy's plea for help with school. Another asked that his older brother get stung by a scorpion. But not too hard. Classic sibling energy. And again, we come to that scholarly shrug. Did they believe the gods were literally listening? Or was the act of whispering itself the point? Some Egyptologists argue that the whispering was a form of performative self-soothing, like journaling out loud. Others think the ears were channels, magical audio ports, if you like, connecting the mortal world to divine frequency. But none of that really changes what the practice meant. It meant you had somewhere to put your feelings. In a society where your social standing was rigid, your afterlife obsessively planned, and your public behavior tightly watched, these temple whispers became little secret gardens of emotion. There are records of merchants whispering confessions about smuggling, midwives asking for protection, young men telling gods they were scared to fight. Nobody was keeping score. The statue never frowned. And perhaps most fascinating, the gods didn't interrupt. They didn't scold. There were no sudden thunderclaps or omens mid-conversation. You just spoke. You let it go. You walked away lighter. One inscription found at Karnak reads, I came broken. I left mended. He heard me. Simple. Soft. True in any century. You lean back against the temple wall, eyes half-lidded, ears tuned to the silence. And in that silence, there's a kind of understanding. Not a response exactly. Just the knowing that your words, however small, didn't vanish. They joined something older, slower, and far more patient than anything human. The statue doesn't blink. Of course it doesn't. But you swear, just for a second. You can feel it leaning in, just a little, listening still. The temple's quiet deepens. The kind of silence that makes your own breath sound like wind. You shift your weight, the stone floor cool beneath your fingers, and you imagine the hundreds, maybe thousands, of people who've done this exact thing, waiting for the right moment to speak softly to something they hoped was listening. But it wasn't a free-for-all. Ancient Egyptians took whispering very seriously. There were rules, procedures. Whispering wasn't just about what you said. It was about how, where, and when you said it. Temple etiquette was as layered as the gods themselves. You couldn't just walk in mid-morning with a mouthful of honey bread and start blurting out your problems to Sekhmet. That would be uncivilized. Instead, there were designated times, usually at dawn or twilight, when the air felt thinner, the boundary between human and divine more permeable. The priests did their grand rituals, yes, but common people had their own rhythms. Quiet visits after the markets closed, soft steps in the half-light of dusk, when the last offerings had been laid, and most of the noise had drained from the city. There were also physical cues. You'd approach the statue from the front, often bowing your head slightly, not necessarily out of fear, but out of deference. Imagine showing up to talk to a very wise, very old friend. You wouldn't just slap them on the back and say, "Hey buddy, got a sec?" People brought offerings, even small ones. A smear of date paste, a loop of reed, a flower still clinging to life. Because even though the gods didn't technically need food, the gesture mattered. It showed intention, like bringing a cup of tea to a friend before venting. And then there was the whisper itself. The tone mattered. You wouldn't shout your grievances. You'd lean in. Sometimes so close your lips almost brushed the statue's cold surface, and speak barely above a breath. The words weren't for anyone else. They weren't even always for the god. They were for you, unspooling thoughts you couldn't say aloud anywhere else. And what did people whisper? That's the question scholars have tried to decode from scattered inscriptions, graffiti, and letters left in temple walls. Some whispers were simple, "Thank you," or "I'm afraid," or "Please let her love me back." Others were more formal. A man from Memphis left a full poetic appeal carved on a limestone slab near a statue's base. He begged for his brother's release from prison. But even in his desperation, he followed every respectful turn of phrase. The structure of his plea was nearly a hymn. There were also whispers you didn't speak aloud. Some people simply sat, eyes closed, mouths shut. The silence itself was the whisper. Reverence doesn't always need sound. In fact, many believed that statues understood intention more than language. If your heart was clear, your presence was enough. But of course, humans being humans, not everyone followed the rules. One temple in Abydos has a small side chamber, a sort of whispering annex, where a priest once scratched a complaint into the wall. "Stop shouting your petitions. The gods do not favor noise." Apparently, even ancient gods had boundaries. You picture that poor priest with his head in his hands as someone outside yelled, "Hy Osiris, myuncle stol mygwagin." Even the architecture played a role in how you whispered. Many temples had long corridors with acoustics so perfect that a single whisper would echo just enough to feel amplified, but not enough to carry. You could pour your soul into a sentence and feel it stretch gently through the stone. A built-in confessional. No priest required. And those whispers weren't just about asking. Sometimes, people reported. One woman, according to surviving records, whispered to a statue that her neighbor had lied about her. She didn't ask for vengeance. She just said, "Let the truth rest in your ears." Which, let's admit, is the classiest subtweet in human history. There were also rituals layered into the whispering. People would circle the statue slowly before speaking. Some would remove their shoes, an echo of later traditions. A few would hum or chant softly first, not unlike tuning the emotional air around them. This wasn't just communication. It was choreography, a sacred dance of words and intention, and it was deeply personal. Temples may have been grand public spaces, but in the presence of a statue, the world shrank to a room with only two souls, yours, and the one you hoped was listening. You imagine yourself now, standing barefoot before a weathered statue of Amun. You feel silly, maybe. You're not religious in the ancient sense. You're not sure what you believe, but still, you lean in. And maybe, just maybe, you whisper something you haven't said out loud in years. Something you needed to say. And then you wait. Not for thunder or miracles. Just for the silence to settle in again, a little warmer now. The air shifts. You don't notice it at first. It's more feeling than fact. The way the shadows stretch. The way the light pools under the statue's chin. You take a slow breath and let it go. You're not alone. No, not in a creepy, midnight, horror story way, but in the gentle, unmistakable sense that someone once stood exactly where you're standing now. Someone with calloused hands and tired eyes. Someone with a whisper to share. Her name's long gone, scrubbed away by time, but let's call her Nenny, a woman from Thebes. Mid-30s, maybe. You imagine her wrapped in a faded linen shawl, sandals worn from walking the same path every day. She comes at sunset, always at sunset, to whisper to her husband. He died 3 flood seasons ago. Fever, they said. One of those ancient catch-all ailments that swept through the city with maddening efficiency. And though he's buried properly, wrapped, honored, mourned, Ninny comes here, not to his tomb, but to a statue of Osiris tucked behind a side altar. Because here, she can talk to him. And here's the emotional core of it all. Egyptians believed that the gods weren't just gods. They were channels, portals, conduits between the living and the dead. Whispering to Osiris wasn't just prayer. It was correspondence. The original spiritual voicemail. Ninny doesn't ask for anything complicated. She doesn't beg for riches or revenge. She just talks. Updates him on the garden. Complains about the market prices. Tells him their son is growing taller and more stubborn. And then, always, she tells him she misses him. Every single day. Some days she brings flowers. Others, a strip of fabric she's sewn. Once, a drawing her son made with red ochre. She lays these things at the statue's feet with the tenderness of someone laying them at her husband's own. We tend to think of ancient grief as stiff, ceremonial, locked inside tomb walls. But grief, even 3 millennia ago, was messy. Daily, loud in the head, quiet in public, and statues, silent, patient, offered the perfect audience. There's archaeological evidence of people treating statues as extensions of loved ones. Letters were tucked into crevices, names scratched in the corners. One woman wrote, "If you see him in the field of reeds, tell him I am lonely but managing." The field of reeds, by the way, was Egypt's idea of paradise. Endless sunshine, gentle rivers, and all the barley you could harvest without back pain. It was where the good souls went after death, assuming they passed the feather test. The long story short, your heart was weighed against a feather. Light heart, eternal chill. Heavy heart, you got eaten by a part crocodile monster. Sleep tight. Beneni believes her husband made it. Of course she does. He was kind. Fair. Not the sort to lie on tax forms. So she whispers to him through the statue, trusting that Osiris is forwarding the message. It's not a one-way ritual. Some nights, she believes he whispers back. Not in words, but in dreams. The Egyptians took dreams very seriously. Entire manuals were written to interpret them. A dream of a lotus meant love. A snake meant betrayal. A bird flying west, you guessed it. Someone's trying to sell your cow without permission. So Nani dreams. And sometimes she swears her husband is in them. He doesn't say much, but he smiles. And in those dreams he's whole. You imagine her walking home afterward, stars blooming above the Nile. The city quiet. Her sandals scuffing on packed earth. And maybe, just maybe, her heart a little lighter. You're starting to understand now, aren't you? Whispering wasn't superstition. It was survival, a daily act of emotional maintenance, a way to carry absence without being crushed. And the statues, they never rejected her, never told her to move on, never got tired of the same story. They just listened. Every night, without interruption, without fading. That kind of patience is rare. Even now, you walk the edge of the courtyard again, brushing past pillars older than language, and you think about everyone like Nini, the quiet grievers. the ones who just needed to say something to someone without being told they were too much. You reach another statue, this one of Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and motherhood. Her expression is serene, her eyes wide, her ears ever so slightly tilted forward. And you wonder, if you whispered something tonight, who might be listening on the other end? So now you're standing before Hathor, the goddess with cow ears and a face that always looks like she's just heard the beginning of a great story. Not surprised, not judging, just interested, open. Like she knows more than you, but she's going to let you talk anyway. This, of course, is the moment you want to ask, what exactly did people say when they whispered? And not just the grieving like Nini, or the people in trouble. What did the everyday person murmur to a block of painted stone in the middle of a dusty courtyard? You might think it was all grand petitions, begging for health, wealth, or protection from crocodiles. And yes, those things did come up. But mostly, people whispered the same kinds of things we might text to a friend in the middle of the night. Small things, embarrassing things, deeply human things. Sometimes people confessed, I took something that wasn't mine. I lied to my sister. I dreamt something that felt like it meant more than it did. There was no hotline to call, no therapy couch. Just you and a statue that never got tired of listening. One scribal apprentice wrote out his worries on a clay tablet before whispering them to a statue of Thoth. If I fail this exam, may my ink dry forever. A dramatic teen, maybe, but also a soul looking for reassurance. Whispering wasn't just for fears or faults either. There were whispers of hope. Let the harvest be good this year. May she notice me at the river. Please, let my baby sleep tonight. One of the more touching records comes from a man who visited a statue of Isis every week to whisper a single sentence. May I not be forgotten. That's it. That's all he asked. Not to be rich, not to live forever, just not to be erased. You realize, standing here, that for every carved wall of triumph and war and ceremony, there were thousands of unrecorded moments of whispered vulnerability. If we had a scroll for every soft secret spoken to a stone god, we'd need an archive the size of the Sahara. People also used whispering to make peace with themselves, to say out loud what couldn't be said in public, to narrate emotions they didn't fully understand. Like the young priest who confessed, in a scribbled side note on a hymn, I do not always feel the joy I sing about. Statues became emotional mirrors, reflections of the inner self through a divine filter. It wasn't just about being heard. It was about hearing yourself, too. And sometimes, hearing your own whisper in a sacred space was enough to make it real. But whispering also had a strange kind of ritual drama to it. You weren't supposed to prepare too much. If your whisper was too polished, too rehearsed, it might not seem sincere. Some priests even warned against over-decoration of petitions, basically saying, don't try to impress the statue with big words. Just say what's in your chest. And if you really needed the statue's attention, you could burn a little myrrh or frankincense while whispering, just to spice the air with seriousness, or draw a small circle around you and the statue's base, creating, in effect, a momentary sacred bubble. Just you and the god. The rest of the world faded out. Of course, some folks tried to game the system. One famous scribe in Amarna is said to have whispered bribes to statues. If you help me today, I'll bring honey next week. Good honey, not the cheap stuff. Whether it worked, history does not say. But you imagine that statue rolling its metaphorical eyes. And then there were the whispers that weren't about asking at all. Some were just thoughts. Today I felt nothing. I saw a heron and it reminded me of a friend. Is there a word for the feeling when you wake and forget who you are? These weren't prayers. They were soul postcards, sent to no one and everyone, addressed to a God who might have already known the answer. And still, people whispered. You press your palms together, not quite in prayer, and glance up at Hather again. You wonder what she's heard. The layers of emotion worn into her silence. Do statues ever feel heavy from the weight of so many human truths? Probably not. They just hold it. And the holding, that stillness, that's what made whispering work. Because when you speak your secret into a quiet space and nothing speaks back, it doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like release. The air is softer now, as if the whole temple has leaned in to listen with you. You're not sure how long you've been here. Hours, maybe. Time folds strangely in places like this. You look up at another statue, this one of a falcon, headed Horus, chipped at the beak but still dignified, and think about what comes after the whisper. Because here's where things get even more interesting. People didn't just whisper and walk away. They often expected a reply. Not from the statue itself, of course. There weren't hidden speakers or secret priests hiding in walls. The reply came later, and often in a very specific way. Dreams. Egyptians placed immense faith in the dream world. It was, to them, a parallel reality, not a fog of nonsense, but a channel of communication. When you fell asleep, your soul, the Ba, the part that could fly, would rise out of your body and travel through realms, past gates, into places humans couldn't otherwise reach. And in that place, the gods might answer. So after whispering to a statue, you'd go home, lie down, and wait for sleep to take you. You might leave a special amulet under your pillow, or eat a specific herb said to enhance dreams, like blue lotus, which had mild psychoactive effects. Not exactly NyQuil, but close. You'd hope for a dream that made sense, one where the god appeared, maybe in human form or animal guise, and offered a sign. Sometimes they'd speak, sometimes they'd just look at you. Occasionally, the dream would be so cryptic it needed interpretation. Luckily, dream interpreters were a common service in Egyptian cities. Picture a man with kohl-lined eyes and an attitude, flipping through a battered scroll of dream symbols while chewing a date. You walk in and say, I dreamt of 2 crocodiles in a boat made of bread. And he goes, that's either marriage or taxes. The one famous dream interpreter's journal records dozens of such translations. A scorpion in your left hand. Danger from a friend. A cat in your lap. Joy. A broken pot. Someone is hiding something. Dream logic, but with emotional wisdom baked in. And sometimes, the dream didn't need decoding at all. You just felt the answer. Like one man who, after whispering to the statue of Sekhmet about his constant fear, dreamt of standing in a red field while a lion watched calmly from a hill. He woke up unafraid for the first time in months. Of course, not every dream was divine. Sometimes you just ate bad fish and had visions of your cousin juggling chickens. But the act of expecting a reply meant your brain opened a door, an openness to resolution, even if it came through your subconscious. Statues and dreams became partners in emotional processing. Whisper here, receive there. Some temples even had designated dream chambers, quiet, dark rooms where you could lie down after a ritual and hope for a vision. The Temple of Serapis in Alexandria was particularly famous for this. Pilgrims would sleep on straw mats, wrapped in linen, waiting for the god to slip into their dreams with advice, healing, or at least a cryptic emoji. But not all responses came at night. Sometimes the answer showed up the next day. A letter you'd forgotten about, a shift in someone's tone, or just a gut-level shift in yourself. You didn't need fireworks. The whisper had been heard, and something in the world realigned. Even priests believed this. One wrote, in a preserved scroll, "I spoke to the stone with no tongue, and it turned the tide of my thoughts." He doesn't mention a dream, just a change. A release. Like saying the thing was enough. You sit down again, letting your back rest against the temple wall. The stone still warm. Somewhere in the reeds beyond the courtyard, a bird calls. Distant. Steady. You wonder what it would feel like to whisper something, sleep, and wake with clarity. No alerts, no to-do lists, no algorithms. Just you and a statue, and your own mind shifting back into alignment. The Egyptians didn't invent therapy, but they did invent something adjacent. A system of thought and ritual where your words mattered, even if no one responded out loud. Because deep down, they knew what we still know sometimes. The act of whispering isn't about getting an answer. It's about being still enough to notice the answer that's already forming inside you. You stretch your legs a little, brushing your fingertips along the edge of the floor, where centuries of footsteps have worn the sandstone smooth. You're surrounded by so many statues now that you can't help but feel like you've wandered into a very well-behaved crowd. All standing still, all staring forward, all waiting. But don't let their stillness fool you. These statues had routines. And just like celebrities who travel with stylists and managers, statues in ancient Egypt didn't just exist. They were maintained, pampered, and cared for by teams of priests who treated them like living royalty. Let's start with the ears, because yes, even the ears were cleaned. You can imagine the scene, a line of temple attendants moving from statue to statue at dawn, wiping off the night's dust, brushing the crevices gently, and sometimes even whispering greetings as they went. It wasn't exactly a spa day, but it came close. One specific ritual involved the ceremonial feeding of the gods. Priests would place trays of fresh food in front of the statues every day. Bread, beer, fruits, roast meat. Not because the statue would, physically eat it, but because the act of giving symbolized devotion. Afterwards, once the god had consumed the essence of the food, the leftovers were taken away and distributed to temple staff. A divine buffet with a very generous doggy bag policy. There were also perfume rituals. You heard that right, perfume. The priests would anoint the statues with scented oils, rubbing the stone lings with mixtures of myrrh, lotus, and cinnamon. It was both symbolic and practical. The oils preserved the stone and reminded everyone that gods, like guests, should smell nice. And of course, there were clothes. Many statues were dressed. In some temples, the deities' garments were changed daily. Seasonal colors, festival robes, jewelry added or removed depending on the lunar calendar. One statue of Amun is recorded as having over 60 different outfits. Truly the original fashion influencer. There's something oddly touching about this care. These priests didn't just serve the gods, they served the statues as extensions of those gods. With tenderness, with precision, and with a sort of humble devotion you don't often see in today's world. Unless someone's detailing a vintage car. One priest's record from Karnak describes bathing a statue with blessed water from the first draw of the Nile. While singing a hymn about inner clarity, he wasn't just washing the stone. He was renewing the bond between mortal and divine. And those ears, those oversized, ever-listening ears, they got special attention. If a statue's ear was cracked or worn, a scribe would be summoned to recarve it. If an ear was seen as clouded, a priest might touch it with cedar oil and whisper a cleansing spell. Why? Because if the ears didn't work, the whole spiritual telephone line might go dead. You smile at the thought even divine beings, it seems, need regular maintenance, and the public noticed. In fact, some festivals allowed regular people, not just priests, to help in minor acts of care. A woman might be allowed to dust a small family shrine. A child might light incense at a statue's feet. It gave them a sense of connection, not just to the god, but to the larger rhythm of tending something sacred, and this daily care extended beyond the temple walls. In homes across Egypt, tiny household statues received their own whispers and their own cleaning rituals. They weren't as elaborate, no wardrobes or fragrance oils, but the emotional intention was the same. One family kept a small statue of Bez, the protector god, near their front door. Every evening, before bed, they'd whisper thanks for the day and ask him to guard their dreams. Once a week, they'd wipe his stubby face with a damp cloth, just to make sure he could still see. It's that same old idea: if something listens to you, you take care of it. We don't clean our smartphones out of gratitude, but maybe we should. You sit now beside one of the larger statues, a nearly 5-meter tall form of Ptah, whose ears have been recarved more than once. His gaze is chipped, his arms crossed in classic ancient Egyptian serenity. You wonder how many hands have washed his feet, how many offerings placed near that still pedestal, how many hopes whispered upward like steam, and you feel, all at once, that caretaking is a form of communication too. Even when the whisper is over, even when there are no more words, wiping the dust from the ears of a silent God still says, "I want to be heard." You rise and wander again, following the edge of the temple, where the light dips low and shadows stretch long. The grandeur of the place begins to feel familiar now, less like a monument and more like a living room with extremely dramatic decor. You round a corner and arrive at a courtyard where something strange is happening. A festival. Well, not right now, but you can see the marks of it. The faded paint near the statue's base, the cracked remains of an incense pot. Someone, centuries ago, carved a rough little lotus next to the threshold stone. This was a place where things got loud. Because here's the fascinating contradiction of whispering to statues in ancient Egypt. Sometimes it happened in the middle of a very public spectacle. Temples weren't always hushed sanctuaries. During festivals like the Opet or the Feast of the Valley, these places would explode with color, music, and the kind of joyful noise that made statues rattle on their pedestals. The gods were paraded through the streets. Dancers whirled, flutes sang, children threw flower petals like divine confetti. And right there, in the middle of all that chaos, someone would step up to a statue, painted, crowned, swaying on a portable shrine, and lean closer to whisper. Imagine that in a square packed shoulder to shoulder, full of cymbals and tambourines, you still press your lips to the stone and murmur something too personal to shout. There's something almost cinematic about it. The world roaring, but your voice quiet, like finding a pocket of stillness inside a song. These public statues weren't reserved for the elite. During festival processions, even those who never set foot in the inner sanctums could get close. A farmer from the outskirts, a street vendor with stained hands, a child holding their breath. Anyone could whisper. Anyone could be heard. There's a beautiful kind of democracy in that. A temple might have an official whispering chamber for for the scribes and priests, yes. But the mobile shrines, the festival floats with their glittering gods, belonged to the people. And it wasn't just joy people whispered. Some whispered confessions into statues moving past them on palanquins, as if the motion would carry the words faster to the heavens. Others pressed worries into the statue's base with their hands, then pulled away as if leaving the burden behind. One inscription from a festival in Edfu reads, "I placed my sorrow into the foot of Horus. He carried it forward." That image lingers, your sadness, passed like a secret into the stride of a statue as it's carried down the street. Of course, public whispering came with risks. You had to speak just quietly enough not to be overheard by nosy neighbors, but loud enough that the god might catch it between cymbal crashes. A delicate art, probably something you practiced in the bath. And in these public spaces, emotions weren't always solemn. Some people made jokes, whispered flirty comments. One bored baker is rumored to have leaned into a statue of Anubis and said, "Next time you guide souls, could you carry my bread too?" Divine shade, 1200 BCE edition. But humor, in a way, was its own reverence. The gods weren't fragile. They weren't just judges. They were companions in life. Statues weren't cold monuments. They were social fixtures. People smiled at them, winked at them, rolled their eyes dramatically at them when things went wrong. You spot one statue in the corner of the courtyard, eyes slanted slightly, mouth carved in the faintest of smirks. Not a full smile, just a curve. You wonder, was it always carved that way? Or did centuries of whispers settle in the stone and nudge it, ever so slightly, toward amusement? And here's something subtle but important. Whispering in public wasn't considered embarrassing. It wasn't a mark of weakness to have feelings. If anything, it was proof of your participation in the sacred rhythm of life. You had feelings, therefore you whispered. End of story. The people who stood before these statues weren't broken. They were just alive, with joys, aches, longings. And the gods didn't require you to solve those things first. They just required your presence. You step away now, letting your fingers trail along the grooves of the threshold stone. Beneath your feet, countless others have stood, some laughing, some crying, all of them whispering to the same unblinking eyes. And the statue never flinched, never flinches, still listening, even as the festival fades, and the temple returns to stillness. You slip into a narrower corridor now, where the walls lean closer, and the torchlight from your imagination flickers, just enough to make the shadows move. The statues here are smaller, worn smooth in places where hands have touched them for centuries. The air feels different, closer, softer, less ceremonial, more personal. This, you sense, is where people came not to worship, but to heal. Because whispering in ancient Egypt wasn't just religious. It was a kind of emotional maintenance. Whispering to statues was one of the earliest forms of what we might now call mental hygiene. You feel it, don't you? That need to say something aloud just to stop it from echoing inside your own skull. The Egyptians knew that feeling too. They just had a very elegant solution, say it to a god, shaped in stone, who won't interrupt or tweet about it later. They believed illness had emotional causes. A troubled heart could lead to a troubled body, and while they had medical treatments, herbs, ointments, and rituals involving crocodile dung, don't ask, there was also a deep recognition that stress, guilt, and fear had power. Power that could be whispered away. One priest wrote in a temple journal, "A man who has not spoken his sorrow walks bent." That's not metaphor, that's diagnosis. So temples weren't just places to ask for divine favor. They were emotional detox centers. You came, you whispered your tangled knots into the ear of a statue, and you left with fewer shadows than you brought. One practice involved writing your distress on a scrap of papyrus and tucking it under the statue's base. Like sliding a note to a friend in class, hoping they understand you even if you're not making sense. People whispered about dreams they couldn't shake, about anger that wouldn't soften, about mistakes that haunted them long after the moment had passed. I lied. One inscription reads, "I wish I had not." That's it. No plea. Just the ache of honesty. And what happened next? Often nothing. Not visibly, anyway. But the relief was real. It wasn't magic. It was release. Sometimes people came in groups, whispering together. Families crouched at the feet of statues, murmuring as one, like shared therapy. But instead of a circle of folding chairs, you got columns, incense, and the gentle presence of Thoth's ibis head, listening quietly in the corner. And this whispering, as cleansing, had ripple effects. There are letters written between distant family members that mention, "I hope your whisper to Hathor brought you peace." Or, "Did the statue listen to your fear?" These weren't dramatic gestures. They were part of the rhythm of daily life. As natural as washing your hands or combing your hair. You took care of your mind by telling it to a statue. It wasn't always sorrow, either. Whispers helped with conflict resolution. If you had a fight with someone you couldn't face yet, you whispered about it first. "May I find the right words?" People would murmur, "Let my anger become smaller." And sometimes they whispered about the future. Not just what they wanted, but how they hoped to handle it. "Let me not be foolish when I speak to him. Let me see clearly before I decide." That's not a prayer. That's a goal set in stone. There were even whispered resets. One practice involved whispering all your regrets from the past month into a statue's ear during the new moon, then walking 3 times around the temple and leaving through the opposite door. A hard emotional reboot. No charger required. You pause beside a statue now. This one only waist high, probably moved from a smaller village shrine long ago. Its ears are worn almost flat, rubbed smooth by centuries of fingertips and foreheads. You kneel slowly, brush some imaginary dust from the base, and try to imagine what your own whisper would be. Not something big, just something honest. Maybe it's, "I keep trying to do the right thing and still feel lost." Or, "I wish I hadn't said that thing I said." Or even, "I don't know what I want, but I know it's not this." That's the magic of whispering. You don't need the whole answer. You just need the next breath, the next tiny step toward release. And when you speak it, even quietly, even in your mind, it starts to weigh less. You lean back, breathing a little deeper. The corridor is still, the statue unmoving. But something in your chest has shifted, slightly. And sometimes that's all healing needs. The temple begins to quiet again as the evening air deepens, and the shadows take over the stone. You slowly rise, brushing off the soft dust, feeling the weight of the day's whispers settling somewhere deeper in you. This place, you realize, isn't just about gods. It's about the spaces they inhabit. The way silence here isn't empty, but full of something old, something comforting, something steady. You leave the corridor and step back into the open courtyard. The breeze is cooling now, the night creeping in with gentle assurance. And as you wander back toward the temple's entrance, you find yourself reflecting on something you hadn't noticed before: the power of silence. It's strange, isn't it? In the world of modern noise, where everything competes for attention and nothing quite lets you breathe, the idea that silence itself could be sacred feels almost radical. Yet, the Egyptians believed that silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a form of respect, a spiritual state that allowed the gods to listen deeply. And when you whispered to those gods in return, you were listening just as much as they were. And that's the crux of it. Silence, to the Egyptians, was more than just a tool. It was an act of trust. Trust that your words would be heard, even if they weren't shouted. Trust that the statues, their exaggerated ears, would take the burden of your troubles, your hopes, your desires, without judgment. Trust that the gods didn't require your loudness. They required your sincerity, your stillness. The practice of whispering wasn't about performing for the divine. It was about surrendering to the silence and allowing it to hold your heart, your emotions, your small confessions and grand wishes. It wasn't always about asking for something. Sometimes it was simply about being seen. Even when no one else could see you, you stopped by one last statue, a small one of a seated man with a beard, his eyes narrowed in peaceful contemplation. You wonder who sat here before you, who whispered the same words you want to speak. And you think of the quiet comfort in knowing that, for centuries, people have come to this same stone for the same reason, not to be fixed, but to be heard. And in that moment, you realize something profound. Maybe, just maybe, the gods didn't need us to be perfect. They didn't need us to be loud or grand. They didn't even need us to be right. They just needed us to be honest. The Egyptians didn't build their temples out of marble and gold for decoration. They built them for listening. Every statue, every inscription, every offering was a way to say, "We are here. We are speaking. And we trust that you'll hear us, even when the words are soft." You walk toward the exit now, feeling the cool night air against your skin, feeling the weight of the day's whispers still lingering in the space between you and the stones. It's quieter now. No crowds, no music, no festivals. Just you and the gentle hum of the world turning. And you realize that sometimes, when the world outside is too loud, it's in these quiet moments, in these whispered confessions, that we find our peace. As you leave the temple, you don't feel heavy anymore. You feel lighter. The burden of whatever you whispered today, whatever you had carried, has lifted. And the next time you face a difficult choice, a quiet frustration, or just the need to be heard, you'll remember the lesson of the statue's ears. Because, in the end, it's not the gods who need our words. It's us who need to hear ourselves. The path from the temple curves gently under your feet as you make your way back toward the entrance. But something tugs at you, a lingering thought. What happens when you don't feel heard? Not every whisper brings comfort. Not every night in front of a statue ends in peace. Sometimes the silence feels too silent, the stone too cold, the gods too far. And the Egyptians knew that too. They built their entire spiritual framework on balance, light and dark, chaos and order, presence and absence. So they made space, ritually, emotionally, for the possibility that sometimes the gods wouldn't respond, or at least not in the way you'd hoped. Picture it: a farmer kneels before a statue of Osiris, his crop withering despite offerings, despite prayers, despite all the rituals done right. He whispers, "Why haven't you helped?" He leaves uncertain. That night, no dream comes. No omen arrives. The drought continues. It's easy to imagine he might have felt ignored, or worse, unworthy. And this fear, this ache of silence, was so common that entire rituals developed just to address it. Some were called reconciliation offerings, gifts brought not to ask for something new, but to rebuild trust between human and divine. Bread, beer, flowers, a statue polish, a whispered apology. Forgive me if I spoke poorly. They weren't sure whether the silence meant the gods were displeased, or merely busy with someone else's tragedy. But even in that uncertainty, they kept whispering. Because to stop whispering entirely, that was a much deeper fear. There's one temple graffito in particular, carved by a man named Nebaman, that reads, "You have not answered me. I will return tomorrow." That one line says everything. Disappointment, yes, but also loyalty, hope, the belief that being heard was still possible, even if not right away. And so people came back, again and again. Like returning to a friend who'd grown quiet. Like standing outside a door you believe will open, even if it's taken longer than expected. Some even created their own responses when the gods remained silent. A woman in one fragment of a private journal writes, "If the God does not speak, then I will be his voice today." She then proceeds to write herself a little poem, full of reassurance and imagined divine kindness. Was it real? Maybe not. But did it help? Probably more than we'll ever know. Because the need to feel heard is so deep, so universal, that we often build our own echoes when silence threatens to crush us. This emotional improvisation, whispering into stillness and answering yourself with hope, is one of the oldest human survival tools. It's not foolishness. It's brilliance. Even the gods, in some stories, experienced this loneliness. Myths tell of Isis wandering in search of Osiris, speaking into the wind, or of Thoth, muttering to himself in silence before inventing writing so his thoughts wouldn't disappear. There's even a tale in which a minor deity, frustrated by constant prayers, retreats to a hidden cave, refusing to listen, and yet the people kept whispering anyway. Not because they thought the god was listening, but because they needed to believe someone might be. Isn't that what we all do? When we mutter in the car after a bad day, when we leave voice notes we don't send, when we talk to ourselves in the mirror, not to be answered, but to say something out loud, just so it exists. You walk slowly now, tracing your hand along the wall as you go. And you wonder, what if the purpose of whispering wasn't just to be heard by the divine? What if it was to prove to yourself that your voice still mattered? Even when no one replies, even when the stone stays cold, even when your whisper disappears into the breeze, there's a power in choosing to speak anyway. So yes, sometimes the statues didn't answer, and the gods remained silent, and the dreams stayed dark. But still, they whispered. And in doing so, they reminded themselves, I am still here. You walk now beneath a high lintel where the moonlight spills down like silver ink, illuminating a statue that's more than just cracked. It's broken. Its face is sheared clean off, its ear gone entirely. For a moment, it looks forgotten, but someone has placed a fresh flower at its base. There's a story in that, because even broken statues, especially broken ones, weren't discarded in ancient Egypt. They were kept, honored, and in some cases blamed. Yes, blamed. You see, when a community faced hardship, crop failure, plague, flooding, people didn't always turn inward. They sometimes looked at the gods. And if the gods weren't answering, if dreams were unclear, if whispering brought no relief, the statue might be the problem. It sounds strange now, holding a piece of stone responsible. But in a culture where statues were gods, or at least divine vessels, a cracked, damaged, or unresponsive statue could mean the god was displeased, distracted, or absent entirely, and so, occasionally, the statue was put on trial. There's a recorded case from the town of Esna in the late period, where the statue of a local fertility god was paraded through the village during a time of failed harvests. The people whispered, loudly, this time, not prayers but complaints. You have not helped. You let our children go hungry. Why did you turn away? A scribe present at the ritual wrote, they spoke to the god as if to a father who had forgotten their names. It wasn't hate. It was heartbreak. And after the ritual, the priests didn't scold the people. They acknowledged the whispers. They agreed that the god must be petitioned more sincerely, perhaps even reprimanded with more ritual. Imagine that, a divine being scolded by its own caretakers, not out of disrespect, but desperation. One temple even exiled a statue to a side chamber for a month, lighting no incense, offering no prayers, in what amounts to a divine timeout. A symbolic way of saying, if you will not help us, we will stop trying until you remember us. These moments are powerful because they show that ancient faith wasn't blind obedience. It was a relationship, and like any relationship, it came with frustration, disappointment, and the need to speak those feelings aloud. Whispering, in this context, became an act of confrontation as much as confession. And yet, always there was hope for repair. Statues accused of divine neglect were often re-anointed, re-dedicated, sometimes even given new ears, literally carved anew, a second chance, a ritual reconciliation. One cracked statue of Hathor in Kam Ombo was found buried with a note, "May your silence be healed." That line sticks with you, because maybe the silence wasn't punishment. Maybe it was woundedness. And maybe, just maybe, the people whispering to the gods believed they could help the divine become better listeners again. You look at the broken statue in front of you, its face erased, its ear gone, and wonder what it heard before it fell. Was it blamed? Forgotten? Or does the fresh flower at its base mean someone still believes in its patience? Because whispering, even to a broken statue, is still whispering. And that act, small and soft and personal, is enough to renew a connection, not just between mortal and God, but between now and then, between you and whoever left that flower. You kneel down beside the broken pedestal and feel the smooth indent where thousands of hands have rested. You place your hand there too, just for a moment. No whisper this time, just a pause, a shared silence, and the deep, comforting sense that someone did the same thing. The cool night stretches out in front of you now, the temple and its echoes beginning to fade behind, but the thoughts linger. The weight of the whispers, the silence, the soft rhythms of the gods who, even when they didn't answer, still kept their ear turned toward humanity. It's a quiet journey, this one. Not always dramatic, not always earth-shattering. But it is real, it is grounding. You leave the temple grounds, your footsteps now mingling with the sounds of the nighttime world. The distant rustle of palms swaying in the breeze, the muted calls of animals, and the soft rustling of reeds near the water. The city outside this sacred place seems distant, but it's never far enough to completely escape the whispers. They are in the bones of the land, in the language of the earth. And now, as you move away from the temple, you think about how the Egyptians saw the gods, not just as distant figures, not as untouchable beings sitting on pedestals. No, the gods were woven into the fabric of everything. They were part of the air, the earth, the waters. They were present in the very act of living. They didn't just dwell in statues, they dwelled in the world itself. That's why, for the Egyptians, Whispering wasn't just about asking for favors or explaining hardships. It was about understanding that, by speaking, you became part of that eternal dance between the human and the divine. The whisper itself wasn't about receiving. It was a way of engaging with a world that listened, engaging with the unseen, the mysterious, the unknowable. In their world, everything had its place, even if that place was in the heart of a statue. You stop beside a still pool that mirrors the stars, and for a moment, you just let the stillness wash over you, the way it did for the Egyptians standing in the soft shadows of a god. The stillness isn't empty. It isn't barren. It's full of life, full of questions, full of words unsaid and prayers whispered into the dark. And somewhere, maybe not in the way you expect, the gods are listening. As you sit there on the edge of the pool, you realize something. Maybe whispering to statues wasn't about expecting an immediate reply. Maybe it wasn't about answers at all. It was about the act of speaking, the act of giving voice to your innermost thoughts, hopes, and fears. And just as you've been doing all night, just as the ancient Egyptians did, you find that the more you whisper, whether to a god, a friend, or even to yourself, the more it feels like you're being heard. Because in the end, maybe it's not the statue's ears that matter most. It's the fact that you spoke, and in the act of speaking, you allowed your voice to stretch into the silence and find its place in the world. So you sit for a while longer, the moon rising higher above the horizon. The whispers of ancient people fade into the night, but you realize they're never really gone. They're part of the temple, part of the land, part of the air, and they're part of you too. You stand, taking one last look at the ancient, silent statues, each of them listening, waiting, and holding space for all who came before. And, finally, you whisper a word of your own, one that's always been there, but never said aloud. A word for the journey, for the silence, and for the quiet comfort of knowing that, sometimes, the only answer you need is to be heard. You let the silence envelop you, just for a moment, and realize that you don't have to fill it with anything. It is enough, and in the peace of that moment you smile to yourself. Because maybe, just maybe, you're finally learning what it means to truly listen. To listen to yourself. As you stand there by the pool, the weight of your thoughts lightens, as if the temple itself has given you space to breathe. The quiet is no longer daunting. It feels almost like a gift. You wonder what it would be like to carry this stillness with you. To walk through the world, whispering your hopes and worries to the statues, the trees, the stars, and never feeling alone in the silence. But as the night continues to unfold around you, you realize that this isn't just about whispering to statues. It's about the essence of what it means to listen, to yourself, to others, and to the silence that sometimes speaks louder than words ever could. This whole journey, this exploration of ancient Egypt's rituals of whispering, wasn't about the gods themselves. It was about human connection, the connection between yourself and the world and the divine, and ultimately, between you and your own heart. The act of whispering allowed the Egyptians to feel heard, to express their deepest desires, regrets, and wishes, without fear of judgment, without hesitation. You think back to Nini, the grieving widow, and the simple way she spoke to her husband's statue, day after day. She didn't expect an immediate answer. She didn't seek a grand revelation. She simply needed to speak, to say what was on her heart, to acknowledge the space between herself and the world she once shared with him. And that's where the magic was. The magic wasn't in the response. It was in the connection. In the act of speaking into the silence, knowing that somewhere, in some corner of the universe, someone, or something, was listening. And as you turn back toward the path leading away from the temple, the thought lingers in your mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, the most divine act of all is not to be heard, but to hear. To listen to the whispers of the past, the world, and your own soul. Maybe that's the greatest gift the Egyptians gave us. The understanding that in silence, we can find the deepest answers. In stillness, we can find the space to breathe, to reflect, and to move forward. The gods may not have always answered, but in the act of listening, they gave us something even more valuable, the ability to find our own answers. You pause for a moment, allowing the cool night air to wrap around you. The temple is now behind you, but the echoes of its whispered wisdom remain, like a soft hum under the stars. In the distance, you hear the faint rustle of wind, and it feels like the world itself is exhaling a sigh, a soft, ancient breath that has carried on for millennia, waiting for someone, anyone to listen. And now, as you walk away, you know that it's not just the gods who listen. It's you too. You are the one who's learned to hear, and in that act, you find peace. Now, the whispers of the past fade into the night. You are free to carry them with you, always. And as you continue your journey, you realize that every word spoken, every whisper shared, and every silence held is part of the sacred rhythm of life. Now the temple has quieted, the stars are brighter, and you, in this moment, are exactly where you need to be.